Hi Year 11 and welcome to this video just going through the characters in An Inspector Calls. So I'm just going to focus on the Burlings, Gerald and the Inspector in this video. I'm not going to talk about Edna or Eva Smith, so please make sure that you've done a little bit of work on those two characters. Obviously minor characters, unlikely to come up in their own question, but could definitely be used for a question on social class or the role of women or inequality, unfair treatment, etc, etc. So beginning with Mr. Arthur Burling. So Mr. Burling, as we well know, is an arrogant, pompous and selfish individual. He only cares about appearances and his social status, things like his knighthood, and not the actual reality of what himself and his family do. Burling is clearly used to getting his own way as a powerful capitalist, and he doesn't like it when the inspector comes in and challenges him. And he cares, whilst presenting himself as a family man, he clearly cares more about his own business than his family. And I think his response to Sheila when we find out about Gerald's affair is most evident. The way that he kind of like blusters is like, now then Sheila, because he obviously doesn't want to lose that business merger with Gerald's family. And ultimately, Mr. Burling remains a flat character or a static character, as he is unchanged by the events of the play. He begins and ends the play in exactly the same way as this kind of steadfast capitalist. So if we think about delving into our AO3, which we're going to do with each character, why is Mr. Burling important? Like if we get a question on him, how does Priestley use him? What is he being used deliberately to show as a kind of like as a construct, as a puppet, as a kind of like mirror to society? So there are lots and lots of different things that we could say. These are just some ideas. So Mr. Burling obviously represents middle class men who've made money via capitalism. Due to the way in which he's made his industry, he's always going to support capitalism because of that. He refuses to accept responsibility for anyone else except himself. In some ways, he's quite similar to Scrooge with that kind of dog-eat-dog attitude. He's like, I've made my way up in the world. Why can't other people? Whereas we, particularly as a modern audience, might look at him and go, well, you're the worst example of kind of like society, because you're someone who knows what it was like to not have money and to have to work hard for it, but you're unwilling to help others who might not have had the opportunities that you've had. And that comes back again to why he represents capitalism and its ideal values of kind of like work hard and you will be rewarded. And obviously he represents the older generation that is less likely to be influenced by ideas of socialism. And Priestley uses him as a warning to us as a society about the negative impacts of that, not just because of people like Mr. Burling, but because of the legacy that he has. The way that his children behave is largely due to his capitalist parenting. So in terms of some quotations, I'm not going to go through these. There are loads of other quotations that I would use as well. Opening stage directions are always super important, but you can pause the video here, make a note of these, think about engaging a little bit of analysis, adding down some of your own, or doing some wider research for these. So Mrs. Sybil Burling, our rather cold woman, opening stage directions, the matriarch of the household, and due to her role as, quote, her husband's social superior, end quote, largely the one in proper charge and power in the household, if that made any sense. So Mrs. Burling is arrogant and selfish. She admits herself to being largely prejudiced against the lower classes, and she is aware that she's married beneath her social status. And it's interesting that while she says very little in Act 1, most of what she says is a chastisement or a telling off of her family, particularly her husband, but her family in general. Linking to that, we could kind of argue that shows she's not a particularly good mother, like she's more entrenched in those Victorian attitudes. She's a woman in her 50s, that's another quote. So she was obviously born and raised in the late Victorian period. Our play is set in 1912, so we can see that there's quite a difference here, and yet she continues to parent her children as if it's the Victorian era, with those very kind of strict like etiquette lessons and kind of like class differences. Her charity work, her role as a chair, quotation there, of the, quote, Bromley Women's Charitable Organisation, end quote, is conducted for purely selfish reasons. It's all about her appearance and the way she appears to others rather than any kind of benevolent philanthropic duty. And just like her husband, she remains a flat, static character as she's unchanged by the events of the play. So why is Mrs. Burling important? We can say many of the same things as we do for Mr. Burling, but we want to be more specific than that if we're aiming for kind of anything over half marks. So she represents many of the upper and middle class attitudes of the time: the arrogance, the sanctimoniousness, so thinking that you're better than everyone else, the snobbishness, the selfishness. They're all really crystallised within Mrs. Burling's character. She is part, as we've already said, for someone who was raised in the Victorian era, she's part of a traditional, outdated older generation who refuses to change or accept new ideas. She's happy to live in the status quo, to prosper in her role as the wife, the kind of matriarch of a powerful, rich man. So she sees no need to change. And Priestley really kind of lambasts, criticises her for that. And she uses her influence, that one-word quotation, to hurt other people rather than help them. And therefore, it's really difficult for us as an audience to do anything but dislike Mrs. Burling, as is in the case of her husband. I think if you ever got a question asking you to like evaluate how far do you feel sympathy or something like that for them, the only real things that we can say is that they're a product of their own time periods. But then the immediate flip side of that is that, but they could have chosen to change and they choose not to. So there's not really any sympathy that can be felt for her. Some quotations, again, there's lots more quotations we could use for Mrs. Burling. As I said before, opening stage directions, a rather cold woman, her husband's social superior, really, Sheila, the things you girls pick up nowadays. There's lots of other quotations we can use for her throughout the text, but good ones here. I really noticed that repeated use of I. It's all about her, isn't it? That first person pronoun. So moving on to Sheila Burling. Sheila is a character who, from the start, she's described as very pleased with life and rather excited in her opening stage directions. And this gives the impression of her being very infantile and childish. However, despite the use of like mummy and daddy and things like that, and saying to Eric that he's squiffy, she's incredibly perceptive right from the start. She sees the truth when others don't. So she sees the truth about Eric and his drinking. She sees the truth, or kind of understands that something is not quite right about the inspector. She realises that Gerald has obviously been having an affair, and there are so many other things that we realise she understands before anyone else does as the play continues. Unlike her parents, she learns from the inspector's visit. His teachings help to strengthen her relationship with her brother and kind of create this sense of community that wasn't there at the start between them. And as the play ends, I think we feel convinced as an audience that Sheila is a dynamic character who is kind of shown penitence and will definitely change her behaviour in the future for the betterment of society. So why is she important? At the start, she shows how gender roles are really clearly defined. She's meant to be the sweet, innocent, naive kind of young woman who looks to her parents and to her fiancé to kind of guide her and make decisions for her. But as the play progresses, her kind of like more independent, feisty side comes out. She has that spirit and she has that spark at the start. So half serious, half playful is a early stage direction for Sheila. There is this sense of maturity that the inspector allows her to give voice to. She becomes more determined, more confrontational towards her parents, and much more self-aware and aware of society as well. And so by the end of the play, she represents a younger generation who are willing to take responsibility. Priestley shows that our kind of maybe future salvation is in the younger generation and their ability to make better choices than their parents. So quotations for Sheila, as I've already said, we've got her opening stage directions, but all those ideas, one-word quotations, mummy, daddy, those, squiffy, as we've said, those ideas about being kind of like led, oh, Gerald, you've got it, is it the one you wanted me to have? Look, mummy, isn't it a beauty? About her engagement ring. But that real socialist awareness from the start. So when she first hears about Eva's death, she says like how horrible, and we can see there from the use of italics, but these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. She understands that these women are not just kind of commodities to be used by capitalism. Eric Burling. So Eric at the start of the play is described as half shy, half assertive, and that kind of oxymoron summarises his character for the rest of the play, really. His heavy drinking is obvious from the start of the play, and we must remember we can't just blame that on his rape of Eva. It is something that's been going on steadily for the past 2 years. So he's been steadily drinking too much for the past 2 years, is the quotation, which shows that it's his struggles with his family and trying to find his own place in the world that begin this spiral. that then ends with or not ends, but continues with the violence towards women that he shows. So he's infantilized and belittled by his family. His father puts him down. His mother often treats him like a young child, and he clearly himself wants to fight back against it, but finds himself powerless to do so. He tries to amend his behaviour. He seems to show genuine remorse for what he does to Eva when he realises, or is made to realise and think about it more, should we say, and therefore he learns from the inspector's visit. I've put here that Eric is likely to behave differently in the future. It's suggested that he will, but I think if you want to be really subtle and really critical, the fact that he shows remorse for acting violently towards a woman, i.e. Eva, and then he threatens, that's the stage direction, his own mother when he finds out that she obviously was kind of responsible for turning away Eva Smith when she was pregnant, and it says like threateningly, and that kind of like he really like squares up to her, I think, and not like explicitly in the stage directions, but it's very much suggested. And for me, I think, well, is that a man who's really learnt his lesson? Like, you could argue with me and say, well, it's the emotion of the time, that he's just found out that his own mother, who's responsible for the death of, you know, his future child. But if we wanted to flip it, then we could say, well, is he really going to change? Has he changed to the extent that Sheila has, or is this something that he's really going to have to keep working on? So why is he important? As with Sheila, he represents a younger generation that are more socially responsible than their parents. He also represents, I would say he's a huge symbol of the kind of warnings of what bad parenting can create. So most of Eric's problems seem to be blamed, like, yes, it is obviously his choices, but they're blamed on his parents and the way that his parents treat him. His drinking, which is kind of like been from how his parents make him feel to begin with, exacerbates or is exacerbated by his guilt after he rapes Eva, and then obviously whether or not he's going to be able to cope with that realization by the end is kind of left as an unanswered question. And it's only because he accepts responsibility and he seems genuinely remorseful that we respect Eric a lot more than we do obviously Gerald or Mr. and Mrs. Burling. So quotations for Eric: the opening stage direction, half shy, half assertive. Remember, just like Sheila, he does show that socialist inkling from the start. He challenges his father. Why shouldn't they try for higher wages? We try for the highest possible prices. So that's a very socialist ideal rather than capitalist. And there is a growing sense of self-awareness as obviously we go through the play with him. Moving on to Gerald Croft. So Gerald is obviously our upper class character. His family are landed, so Sir George Croft and Lady Croft. That means that when they die, Gerald will inherit the title. And it is for that reason that Mr. Burling is incredibly sycophantic towards him, isn't it? He is the ideal match for Sheila due to the business opportunities that he will provide for Mr. Burling. Gerald, in turn, is also sycophantic towards Mr. Burling, which proves his alliance with capitalism at the start. I think at the start we probably feel quite negatively towards Gerald because of the way that we see him acting as a sycophant towards Mr. Burling. I always say I'm a Gerald hater, like there's no bones about that. You're welcome to be more sympathetic. But I would say that, you know, due to those traditional gendered values and those capitalistic values, he's also dishonest, he's hypocritical, and therefore that adds to that kind of unlikability of him. And ultimately, he fails to learn from the inspector and he actively seeks to discredit him. Like, Gerald is the only character that the inspector speaks like mildly appreciatively of. He says that he kind of like made her happy. And I think it's important to remember that Priestley himself had his own affairs. So he's not too bothered about kind of sexual morality. He's bothered about social responsibility. So Gerald fails that test. He refuses to change when he realizes that there won't be any consequences. And I think we're left to wonder with Gerald, like, is that care for Daisy Renton? How far is it genuine? Is that a redeeming feature? Or is it only kind of a way to put us on the back foot, to make us, is it a red herring where we think, that's kind of a narrative term, where basically you think things are going one way and it's actually a kind of like a false clue for us as a reader or an audience member. So do we judge Gerald more harshly in a way because we think he's going to change and then he disappoints us? So why is he important? He obviously represents the upper classes in the play, the landed gentry, the people who fundamentally, as it says at the bottom point, he doesn't need to change. He feels he doesn't need to change because why would he? Life's great for Gerald. And so therefore he's a symbol of how difficult it is to make the aristocrats change, because they don't want to lose their power and status. They're happy with the status quo, and they're happy to keep kind of the wheels of capitalism turning. And again, it links back to that huge sense of disappointment that we feel because we want him to change. We see him have the opportunity to help Daisy. He does give her some money. I would always argue that he could have done even more because he is very rich. But he lets us down entirely by not changing at all. And some quotations here for Gerald. So describing Daisy Renton as it is with him. Very interesting second one. I like to talk about the dashes because this is obviously dramatic methods. It's a drama. Like, is he genuine in his emotion here? Is he putting it on for kind of like effect and giving himself some breathing space? And then obviously he is the person, I think it's really important, he's the catalyst for revealing that the inspector wasn't a real police officer. And making everyone question that. Sheila has suggested it, but Gerald is the one that solidifies it in a very negative way, essentially suggesting they can forget everything that's happened now, which is very much shown by the final quotation, the importance of that ring as a dramatic prop. And finally, Inspector Gould. So the inspector is a very calm but assertive character. He interrogates one character at a time, as we know, one person and one line of inquiry at a time, otherwise there's a muddle. He's incredibly omniscient, and I would argue omnipotent as well, because that knowledge gives him the power. And he's very moral, like we see from the very first when he refuses to accept a drink from Mr. Burling because he's on duty, and that quotation, one word quotation there, that he cannot be corrupted or impacted by the Burlings. He's not there to play their game, he's not there to be used by them, he's there to get to the truth. That is his job. And his final speech is very much like a kind of religious sermon or political diatribe, which gives him this almost prophetic status. It very much reminds us that he is the voice of Priestley. Priestley uses him as a mouthpiece to put across his ideas. So in terms of why he's important, so obviously there's the ambiguity around his character. He seems to be operating on a different level of consciousness. We've got the homophone in his name, so ghoul being a pun on ghoul, as in ghost. We know that he represents the voice of Priestley. It's not subtle in that. And in some ways there's almost biblical kind of levels to him in the messages that he's trying to give. Some people interpret him as speaking for the voices of the working class as a collective, like he is the person who gives them a voice on stage, because the only lower class character we ever see in the play is Edna, and she has something like 6 or 7 lines of dialogue in the entire play anyway, and most of that is kind of agreeing to an order. So the inspector gives a voice to the working classes. Ultimately, though, as I've said before in my terrible TikTok teaching videos, it doesn't matter what the inspector is. It doesn't matter who he is, what he is. It is about what he can teach us that's important. And if we get distracted by working out what or who he is, we are just as bad as the Burlings, and Priestley does not want that. And I've actually gone with very few quotations here for the inspector. There's so many more that we could have, but with the opening stage direction creates at once an impression of massiveness, solidity and purposefulness. Those prophetic lines, like it's better to ask for the earth than to take it. He talks about all of them being connected in a chain of events, which is a great quotation suggesting that sense of shared responsibility. Taking charge masterfully in Act 3 when the family are all squabbling, and it's getting quite violent actually, and he yells stop. I always think that's kind of like the one moment where the inspector might raise his voice. And then that final speech, which is the entirety of his final speech is so important, but teaching them that if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. So hopefully that's helped, just to give you a little recap of our key characters. Obviously, what the exam will tend to like to do is to pair them with a theme. So you might want to have a look at your notes now and think about what kind of themes do you think each of these characters could be paired with? How would you talk about them? A reminder that if you get an essay which is purely thematic, so like the effects of how does Priestley present selfishness and its effects, maybe choose just kind of 2 characters and track their action throughout the play. There are so many brilliant resources online. You've got Mr. Bruff, you've got obviously loads of fantastic resources on BBC Bitesize and Spark Notes and PMT. So do make sure that you use those to add anything else that you need to your Inspector course revision. If you found this helpful, please do like the video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And as always, go well with your revision.